Welcome to this lesson on Byron's When We Two Parted. I probably say this a lot, but I have a real love of Byron. I don't know why. I got really obsessed with him when I was a teenager, and then it sort of just stuck with me since then. So I'm just warning you, I will be very positive about this poem. Sometimes I'm kind of more critical or balanced, but Byron, I don't really have that much bad to say about him. He is very crazy and over the top, and a lot of people don't like him. He's a kind of divisive figure, I think, in history and literature, but I'm a Byron fan personally. So yeah, the poem's called When We Two Parted. It means when the two of us separated or kind of said goodbye, or, that kind of thing. So it's a poem about separation, a poem about a breakup of a relationship, poem of kind of complex feelings that can occur after a relationship ends. Poem from the perspective of a male speaker towards a female subject or addressee. And it's got quite a lot of kind of variety and complexity to it. I see it as a very well accomplished poem on the subject of kind of unsuccessful love and kind of unsuccessful matches. I'm going to read it out to you aloud. As I read, I want you to just kind of circle, highlight, underline anything that really stands out to you that you feel is quite powerful. And then we'll go through the vocab. And while I do that, you can annotate in more detail what you found there. When we two parted in silence and tears, half broken hearted to sever for years, pale grew thy cheek and colder thy kiss, truly that hour foretold sorrow to this. The dew of the morning sunk chill on my brow. It felt like the warning of what I feel now. Thy vows are all broken, and light is thy fame. I hear thy name spoken and share in its shame. They name thee before me, a knell in my ear. A shudder comes o'er me. Why wert thou so dear? They know not I knew thee, who knew thee too well. Long, long shall I rue thee, too deeply to tell. In secret we met, in silence I grieve. Sorry, I don't know why it says Byron there. I have no idea why it says that. In secret we met, in silence I grieve, that thy heart could forget, thy spirit deceive. If I should meet thee after long years, how should I greet thee with silence and tears? Should be able to tell it's got a really clear rhythm, a lot of regularity to it. So the line length is irregular. You can see that just from looking at it, but the kind of rhythm and the feeling of it is quite unchanging, sort of like he just is projecting how he feels in that moment. So as I go through this vocab, there's not tons of vocab here. It's quite a straightforward poem. I want you to just kind of make a couple of your own annotations about what imagery do you find there, or what kind of powerful lines or words did you find, and what do those evoke or conjure in your mind. So parted means separated, went different ways, left each other. So parting is when two things split, or like one thing splits into two, or two people kind of separate. Sever is another word that is in the same semantic field, so it's in the same field of meaning. It means to separate. Sever is a little bit more violent, so part is sort of usually quite mutual or kind of practical, non-emotional. Sever is like if you sever something, severing ties we use a lot in relationships, either friendships or romantic relationships. And to sever ties means you cut all connections with that person. So it's a lot stronger of a word. Thy is just an old-fashioned word meaning your, so it's a possessive pronoun. Foretold means predicted or prophesized. Dew means, dew's a nice little word. It's just kind of the water drops that you get on plants in the early morning, or on anything that's outside in the morning, it gets covered in dew. It's a type of condensation that you get. Vows are promises. A vow can be quite an official promise, like you can vow to do something and it's quite strong and quite official. You take vows when you get married, so you exchange marriage vows, like you promise to one another certain things. Wert thou, again, just a sort of old-fashioned language. Were you, meaning were you. And rue is to regret terribly. So we don't really use this term in the modern world that often, apart from in the phrase, I shall rue the day, like I'll regret the day. So yeah, we don't use it that much anymore, but it's quite common in Byron's time. So deliberately, he's using quite simplistic language that is not too difficult to understand or to kind of engage with immediately. So we're going to jump into the story now. So the speaker, it's quite an interesting story, I think. And it's very autobiographical. So we'll look at the context of this one as well. I think the way to understand this one is to kind of properly be confident with the context. So the speaker says that when he and the addressee separated, it was in silence and with tears. So they couldn't bear to speak to each other, and they were both very upset. Their hearts were half broken, and they were cut off from each other for years. Her cheek became cold, as did her kiss, because she was preparing to cut him off. So she was actually kind of putting herself into a state of getting ready to separate. And he felt really sad about this, but he knew it was necessary. And this was actually a small taste of the larger sorrow that he was to feel later. So now he's reflecting back. So the time period or the tense of this poem is quite important. He's speaking about it from now, looking back on this person who years ago they had a really tender, seemingly quite intense relationship. The morning dew that signaled daybreak made him feel cold, and it showed that it was time for him to leave. This horrible feeling was like a warning about how he would feel now. So again, he's using a compounding effect of foreshadowing. So he's looking back at the past and he's like, there's all these small things that I felt that didn't feel right. They felt bad and wrong. And now it's 10 times more intense, basically, a version of what I was feeling then. So I also feel like that line, the idea about dew and daybreak and, being time to leave. There's a scene in Romeo and Juliet where Romeo's been banished and he's supposed to not be in the city anymore. And he spends one last evening with his wife at the time, Juliet. And and then he runs. And there's this kind of, this thing in the morning where he wakes up and Juliet's trying to convince him to stay, and she's like, oh, it's not daylight yet. And he's like, no, I need to go. I'm going to get killed because he's been banished. And I feel like Byron's sort of drawing on that tragic kind of trope of lovers parting in the morning after they've spent their last evening together. So it is a kind of, it's kind of common in tragic love literature to sort of have that scene where the day breaks and suddenly everything's changed. So what's kind of sad about it really is that her promises to him are broken, and she's now become vaguely famous. So he hears about her a lot, and he hears people speaking about her, and he feels kind of ashamed when he hears about her. So there's suggestion of kind of courtly intrigue, meaning that, all the other aristocrats and people in the same social circle, they start kind of gossiping, and they're sort of talking about her, and maybe he'd sort of managed to sort of put her out of his life for a while, or ignore her, or try and forget her, but now her name's everywhere and he can't really deal with it. We've got this idea of suddenly this kind of pain that he felt has resurfaced and become difficult for him to manage. So his friends and acquaintances, people he knows, speak her name to him, and it sounds like a death bell in his ear every time he hears it. So there's a few different poems in this anthology, that the Cambridge anthology, that have the idea of a death bell, and they combine love and death, or that type of thing. It's quite interesting, like common connection for some reason. So yeah, her name, every time he hears it, is kind of like a death bell. Like it makes him feel like he's going to die, or it makes him feel like his life is over, something like that, we might say. He shudders and he wonders why he cared about her so much. So he feels kind of repulsed when he hears her name. Again, there's this suggestion of gossip, intrigue, something. People are sort of saying her name and she's being famous, but in a kind of notorious way, like a gossipy way, not she's great, but people are kind of gossiping about her. And these people who are his friends, who are sort of gossiping, they don't know that he knows her, or that they had an intimate relationship, that he used to know her too well. So he's kept a secret for years, and he's been very silent about it. And now her name is sort of resurfaced, and it's very difficult for him to deal with, because he can't talk to anyone about it, because he never told anybody, and he swore to kind of keep it a secret. And he'll regret her for a long time, too deeply to ever tell anybody about their affair. So he's kind of remaining true and deciding, never to disclose the fact that they had an affair, and that they were an item at one point, or at least kind of secret lovers. They used to meet in secret, and now he grieves for her alone and silently, never talking about it to anyone. So again, just reinforcing that idea. And he's so upset that her heart could forget him and move on, and that her spirit could trick him. Again, connecting to other poems in the Cambridge anthology, if that's the one you're doing with this one. So he's very upset that, he's fixed himself in this moment in time when he was with her, and never really forgotten her, and never forgotten how sad he felt when they had to separate. And she seems to have transitioned and changed and moved on. So it's quite an interesting thematic tension there between change and fixity after relationships sort of end. Do you stay the same, or do you transition? It's like an interesting subtle aspect of kind of broken relationships that he's exploring. So he's very upset that she's moved on. And then he considers what he would do if he actually even saw her again. And he was like, well, I would greet you in silence with tears. So it starts and ends with the imagery of silence and tears as a reinforcement of the idea that he just has not changed his feelings towards her at all. He still feels very tenderly, and he's speechless because he really loves her, but they clearly can't be together. And he feels very upset by the fact that they can't be together. He's sort of saying, nothing's changed on my part, even though there's all this gossip about you, and there's all these ideas about, you seem to have kind of moved on now, and I haven't. He's still like, regardless of all that, I still feel the same about you, and I'll keep my secret that we had this relationship. So it's quite, like I say, quite complex, quite nuanced look at different ways that people react to a relationship breakup, different ways about, the sort of darker aspects to relationships, things like affairs or gossip, stuff that's not just how does it feel to be in a relationship, but all of the kind of angles and perspectives around that. So we're going to jump into the speaker and voice. So the speaker is quite clearly Byron himself. We can say that it's kind of, adopting this role of a tormented lover, which is a typical type of love poem to write in this time. But I feel like it's so kind of clearly autobiographical, as we'll look at in a minute, that even though you could read it kind of impersonally, just exploring this idea of separation and moving on or staying the same, I feel like it's very much tied to a specific moment in Byron's life and a specific person. Usually there's an imbalance between lovers, as there are in other tormented lover poems in the Cambridge collection. And usually there's an imbalance. So one person wants to keep the relationship and one person wants to move on, and or they both agree to separate perhaps as well. But this is really interesting because it's kind of a mutual breakup that both regret. So this woman is obviously kind of tied to someone else who she has to be with. And then she wants to be with Byron, but can't be for whatever reason. So neither of them have a wish to end a relationship necessarily, but they both have a kind of social duty to end it, or a social obligation. So there's a kind of mutuality to the breakup, and the lovers know it's not a suitable relationship because of social reasons, despite the fact that they personally connect and get on. So it's an equal agreement of separation. And it happened a long time in the past, years before. And the speaker still longs for the woman, and so he feels compelled to write a poem that explores this kind of sensitive complexity of feelings, because the reason they broke up is not the same as not loving each other or not liking each other anymore. Sad, this one, isn't it? Don't know if you just like reading it like, oh, poor Byron. I always just feel like, poor Byron. Poor Byron is something that I say quite a lot in my life. But yeah, he's a really incredible figure. Definitely, if you like this poem or you quite like how he explores ideas, then look up his history and, maybe read a biography of him or something. He's really crazy. I kind of want to just go into like a big thing about how awesome Byron is and why he's great, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to make sure that I stick to the poem and I don't just go and be some kind of Byron fangirl. So language, we've got a first person plural pronoun we in the opening line, and in the title, when we two parted. This is the only time that he uses this plural pronoun. So he's talking the point where they're together using the collective pronoun we. And after that, they become separate and that we is no longer used. So the way he's using the pronouns actually reflects the moment of separation. So it's kind of a structural use of a pronoun as well as a language feature. There are motifs, as I mentioned before, silence and tears. These are like little elements that run through the poem and they sort of cycle through and they set the tone and the mood. So it's kind of very somber, tragic mood. And they frame the poem. They start and end this kind of exploration of ideas that he's going through. So they create, again, being tied to structure, they create a cyclical structure that summarizes the feelings. It's almost like he can't quite find the words to say exactly how he feels, but his body is sort of expressing those feelings through not being able to speak, which for Byron is pretty, is quite unusual. He has a lot to say about everything usually. And obviously tears, sadness. And again, he's a kind of quite masculine, sort of like brave figure. Actually led a battle at one point towards the end of his life. To admit that he's got tears and that he's hyper emotional for a man of his standing, especially in this time, to show that kind of vulnerable emotion is quite unusual for a male speaker at this moment in history. And it's quite very sensitive, I think, because he sort of keeps repeating that he's not angry, he's just hurt and he can't express himself properly and he feels betrayed, but his feelings to her don't change. So he's not now embittered or stressed or angry, just that he's kind of plunged into this deep, intense, silent depression that started at the moment when they separated and has continued throughout the last few years until this point where he's writing the poem. I feel like the poem is a cathartic experience for him. So it's a way of releasing these emotions because he must be feeling so intensely kind of sad, I guess, because he can't really talk to anyone about this, as he says in the poem, because he's kept their affair a secret. So no one knows that he knows this woman when they're gossiping about her to him, and he has all these feelings about her, and it can't kind of project anywhere. So he sort of uses the poem to explore these feelings and the subtlety of those emotions. It's kind of what I feel he's doing. So yeah, compound adjective, half broken-hearted. I feel like the sort of hyphen there kind of creates this sense of breaking and splitting, and it's quite complicated by the adverb half. So he's broken-hearted, but he's only half broken-hearted, and they both are really. So he's like, when we two parted, half broken-hearted. Sort of suggests that they're both feeling kind of broken in the same way at the same time, like they sort of mirror each other, which again underneath demonstrates that they're actually really well suited because their reactions are similar and their feelings are similar. So yeah, the broken-hearted in itself is quite a sort of kind of midway concept. So they're not entirely, I don't know if you know what I mean, like they're kind of, half broken-hearted is very complicated. So it's like there's all this kind of agreeing to end it, yet being hurt by it at the same time. There's a semantic field of death, as I sort of started to mention earlier. So this idea of the knell, the bell that he hears that is like a death bell, is also reinforced by the idea of pale grew thy cheek, cold, colder thy kiss, chill on my brow. So everyone, all of their feelings and emotions are turning from passion and heat and warmth and affection to coldness. So it's a sort of metaphorical death that they undergo because they're separating. So the death of love is kind of likened to physical death, where they're growing cold towards each other. So yeah, his forehead has a chill in the morning, and this is quite interesting because it suggests sort of sickness or fever, as if there's something kind of sickening or kind of unhealthy, either about the relationship or perhaps about the end of the relationship, or perhaps he's not quite sure which. At times, there's a little bit of a sardonic, a mocking, sarcastic tone. There's like very, very light touches of irony in this poem, which I think are quite clever and very well hidden. So he says, he's sort of almost about to mock her. He says, light is your fame. So you're kind of vaguely famous now. You have light fame. People are sort of vaguely aware of your name. And it's kind of ambiguous because it could be a compliment that she's grown in fame and people know of her, but it could also be a sort of backhanded compliment about how she's only vaguely famous. She's not really truly famous. So context is really important to understand this line as well, because Byron is kind of credited with being the first ever celebrity. So people were obsessed with him at the time in a kind of love-hate way, and they'd always read in the papers about what has he done next, and who's he annoyed or offended now. So he was always in the newspapers, and he was very notorious and very famous, and quite often negatively depicted in media, and negatively kind of reputed in society. So he's perhaps aware that fame is not a good thing and that he's worried for her, or he's possibly slightly sarcastic and saying, you're getting as famous as me, or you're starting to get famous like me, in a kind of bad way, in a notorious way. So there's a lot of different ways, like a lot of ambiguity to that line and how we could interpret it. And there's actually this thing called Byromania that people got, which is basically they just like went a bit mad about Byron. He's kind of like the sort of the equivalent of a modern day rock star or something like that, the way that people were really interested in him. So so again, this kind of idea of the knell, the death knell, is part of the semantic field of death. The lady's name causes him to shudder, and it sounds like a death bell. So he would have at once lit up at the thought of her name or the thought of her, or that kind of thing, because he really loved her and felt warmth towards her. And now he's kind of repulsed because he's really shocked that he's hearing the name. It's bringing up all these difficult feelings, and also he's probably not hearing it in the best context. There's a rhetorical question. Why were you so dear? Why did I care about you so much? And it's kind of interesting because it's like more aimed at himself than aimed at her, I think. He doesn't really want her to answer why she meant so much to him. It's more his own mind, like, I can't figure out what it was I really loved about you, or I can't really pinpoint what it is that, was so attractive at the time, and still obviously remains, because there's these kind of complex feelings that he can't quite get to the bottom of. So he's clearly not over her entirely. So yeah, there's a separation between the emotion in his soul and his kind of brain's capacity for logic and reason. He's obviously a highly intelligent man who has a good ability to understand the detail and complexity of, different situations, and he can analyze well. But he can't get to the bottom of this idea of, why he liked her so much. He does use past tense here, so it's quite interesting because it kind of potentially suggests that there has been a change in his feelings, because, he's like, why were you so dear to me? Not why are you so dear? So because he's saying, why did I used to like you so much? It maybe suggests that after he's heard this gossip, it has affected his thoughts and feelings towards her, potentially. And finally, there's some synecdoche, which is where a part represents a whole. Thy heart could forget, thy spirit deceive. So he's kind of boiling her down into different parts, like the heart, which is symbolic of love and emotion, the spirit, which is symbolic of the soul. And he's kind of confused about these characteristics, like, how could your heart, which loved me so intensely, forget me even after a few years? And how could your soul, which seemed so pure and so connected to mine, trick me or trick someone else, or so on? So it suggests that he feels like there were these kind of desires and urges that are possibly more complex than he gave them credit for, and maybe she had a contradictory character, or she had things about her that weren't as they seemed. He seems kind of shocked, and he can't quite tell if something's gone wrong with her or if something was wrong in him, like he trusted her too much, or he thought differently about her from how she really was, that kind of thing. There is this word shame as well, which is quite important. The theme or idea of shame, worth kind of exploring that one in detail, because shame, I think, is to do with how you appear in society, or kind of, feeling like you've transgressed a boundary in some way. So we'll have a look at structure and form now. If I go too fast or ramble, feel free to kind of pause me whenever you need and just jot down notes at your own pace, or obviously go back over these videos if you need, that kind of thing. I try and ramble quite quickly just so that it keeps the video to a decent level rather than being super long, because otherwise you're going to look at these poems and be like, oh gosh, it's like 20 hours of work or something like that. So yeah, I try and keep them concise, but it's quite difficult sometimes, especially because my brain starts like thinking of like 10 more things every time I look at these poems, and I try to sort of boil it down rather than just go on forever. Structure and form then. So first of all, there's an AB rhyme scheme. We call this alternate rhyme, and it's oscillating back and forth rather than creating a sense of closure. I interpret this personally as Byron's own deliberation in his mind, where he's really, he already wasn't sure about whether they should end it or not, but they obviously couldn't be together, and it was difficult, and it was a kind of unresolved situation. And then her name being brought back up, but in the context of scandal or gossip, it sort of shed new light on this old problem that already wasn't resolved. So now it's really kind of making his brain sort of skip back and forth. He's very confused about how to feel or what to do, if anything, about it. And he's also quite troubled by the fact that he can't confide in anyone. So yeah, I interpret the alternate rhyme as kind of deliberation, lack of closure. The meter is roughly dactylic diameter, so 3 beats of stressed, unstressed, stressed syllables per foot, 2 feet per line. So there's 2 kind of units of meter per line, and each of those have 3 syllables in them with a stress, unstress, unstress. So for me, this creates a kind of falling rhythm because it's emphasizing the idea of the fall, or the idea of tragedy, or the idea of kind of plunging into sadness or depression, or perhaps the idea of like disintegration. And again, there's this, because the meter is imperfect, it's not perfectly in this meter, it's just generally in it, sort of suggests kind of roughness and lack of perfection to the situation or to their love or something like that. Those are the times when Byron's really accurate with his meter, so it's deliberate that there's imperfections in that meter. If you're not sure about meter, read up a bit more about it so that makes sense to you, because it is a good thing to be able to analyze to a high level in an essay. But yeah, if you're not sure about meter, this will just probably just sound like nonsense. So yeah, make sure you know what that means. There's dashes as well. So punctuation counts as structure, form analysis. I think at the end of certain lines, putting a dash there, it's kind of melodramatic. It suggests this silence that he keeps talking about, the speechlessness, the fact that he really doesn't know how to respond. He's trying to explore the idea, but it's difficult for him. There's moments where he just kind of descends into silence because there's no other way that he can react. So context then. This is the bit that's very important that we have to kind of learn in order to unlock the poem. So it's written in 1816, which is the early 1800s. You call that the 19th century. It's pre-Victorian, so it's not Victorian even though it is 1800s. It's, but I believe by many scholars when I was reading up about it, to be an autobiographical poem that reflects Byron's own life. This is also what I personally believe. Lord Byron had a relationship with a woman called Lady Frances Wedderburn Webster, which is a mouthful. And she was already a married woman, and supposedly Byron had an affair with her. He had a reputation for picking kind of crazy women, difficult, unattainable women, having really intense relationships that didn't last. This is partly why he left like such a kind of crazy, infamous reputation behind him. And it's really debatable whether he was a charmer and a womanizer, or whether he just like really liked crazy women. It's interesting to read about him and decide that for yourself. I'm not quite decided yet with him. So Lady Frances, in this case, definitely had the upper hand over him because she had an affair with him, and for Byron it was something very personal and tragic because he loved her, or he really felt towards, positively towards her, and he couldn't be with her. And then they separated. And after that, she ended up having affairs with other men, not just other kind of general men, but quite famous men in the same way that Byron was famous, or even more so. There's a suggestion that she had a secret relationship with the Duke of Wellington, who's a really famous general at this time, involved in really important battles, who is probably more famous than Byron. So even though Byron's hyper famous, he's not, a famous general in war at this point. Like I say, at the end of his life, he actually was. She supposedly had a secret relationship with the Duke of Wellington, and it's suggested that this is what the poem's about. So Byron's kind of overheard this rumor about their affair, and he's kind of shocked and confused by her, why she would just have another affair with a different man, still being married to the original man that she was married to. And not only any man, but the Duke of Wellington, someone who's more famous than Byron. So he's confused at her ability to move on, And it sort of suggests that their romance or their connection was a lot less special than he thought, because he felt like he had this personal connection, and it was really tragic that they couldn't be together. He's not enraged at her, but he's very tearful and speechless. But I feel as well a little bit that Byron does have a slight ego on him, as most rock stars do nowadays as well. And that probably it's a little bit of a blow to his pride, because it's not just anyone, but it's like a really famous guy, like more famous than Byron. So it's kind of like suggesting that she just really likes famous guys or something like that. So yeah, he feels a little bit like his pride is hurt, I think, which is kind of sad. Another context point that's really important is Romanticism. So Byron is a romantic poet, and it doesn't, when you use it with a capital R, it doesn't mean like love only. It means kind of like Romanticism is generally about kind of nature and spirituality and embracing all of your different kind of impulses and feelings rather than trying to block out your emotions. So at the time that Byron was writing, it was quite typical to not show strong emotions, like I was saying. And the type of poet that he thought that, it was actually more respectful to acknowledge and explore your emotions in their kind of depth and complexity, rather than trying to stamp them out and just be serious or kind of, seem strong and ignore how you really feel. So it's against the general trend in society at the time, which was to repress emotions to seem strong and stable in character. And also, they were quite sort of politically radical romantic poets, and they felt that there's too many social structures that repress this human soul and its capacity for joy and true enlightenment. So they try and actually embrace and explore deeper feelings and emotions, and they embrace this kind of more difficult, complex way of living as well. So yeah, most people in society would, especially men, would not kind of admit that they're crying. But Byron, being a romantic poet, it kind of fits with his character and his ethos of life. So we have a few interesting, quite personal attitudes here. The first one that I think is really present, that I find quite complex, is Byron seems okay with the fact that this woman had one affair, because he's like, well, we should have been together, but we couldn't. But then multiple affairs is a different indication of a different thing from a single affair. So for him, adultery or unfaithfulness is not necessarily always bad. There's a kind of context attached to that. So it's a sin, first of all, in their time. So they feel like, you're probably going to hell if you have an extramarital affair. Also, it's highly frowned upon from social terms. Also, we have this idea of cuckoldry. So the husband himself will be socially kind of lowered in status if the woman is unfaithful to him. But yeah, I feel like Byron felt that they had a true connection, and you were able to kind of excuse the aspect of the affair once, but then if she just keeps repeating that, it's more like she finds it exciting or something, rather than she found Byron special. He's kind of shifted his perception of what their relationship meant. And so it produces shame. Another idea is it can be painful to hear about those that we care for moving on from a previous relationship. This is something that's explored in modern music and, songs a lot. It's a kind of like forever sort of idea about relationships, I think. There's the kind of approach when you have a breakup of allow it to, naturally move on and be happy if your previous partner finds a new partner. Or there's the kind of like, never let go, sort of hold on to it and don't be happy if they move on kind of attitude. Obviously, the first one is more like a more healthy psychologically healthy approach to relationships and breakups, because as you can see here, with Byron, he's never really probably moved on from this woman, and now he's getting very affected, even years later, by the mere thought or mention of her by, his friends who don't really know her. So there's a sense of catharsis, as I was saying before, about how he writes his thoughts and feelings in a poem. And I sort of interpret it as he's trying to move on now, because he's like, okay, I left it for years, being still kind of half in love with you and half brokenhearted. I didn't really resolve these feelings, and now they've come back, but also you seems to have moved on. I need to really, change my attitude as well. So I think he's sort of trying to get himself to move on in this case. There's also this kind of idea that, love in itself is not enough, or strong attraction or affection or even tenderness is not enough to sustain a relationship. So this is also to do with the 19th century attitude to marriage and the contrast between marriage being a social contract or a personal choice. So nowadays we still have arranged marriages or kind of social reasons for marriage, but it's not quite as strongly imposed as it was back in the 19th century. So with this woman, it's completely valid to sort of suggest that she married not for love, but for social or financial reasons. She's clearly not happy in her marriage because she has these affairs, which is an indication of unhappiness. So we could actually sympathize with her and say that she's a victim of society. And, the speaker feels like he's been victimized by her, but she in turn has been victimized by these very strict rules that have been imposed upon her that she can't get out of. So we could see that, we could say that she's a victim too. She's not just necessarily, she might not be doing it deliberately to hurt Byron. It might be something going on with her own life or her own circumstances. So I'm going to leave you with some themes then to think about. If you want to sketch out some essay plans to do with these themes and how Byron represents them in the poem, that will help you get all your ideas in order. And it's always good to, at least on any poem that you feel a connection to, I would suggest trying a full essay as well. So hopefully you like this one. I really like this one. I think it's a sad poem, and it's it's got a lot to it, and it's very, there's just like so much there. Like it sounds so simple when you read it, and it just has this really like basic language, and then you pick it apart and it's just full of all this kind of crazy stuff. So I really respect it as a poem. I think it's great, even though it's not necessarily like the happiest poem or anything like that. So hopefully you find a connection with it too. You find it interesting, and if you do, I would suggest taking this lesson a little bit further, doing some essay plans and maybe writing a full essay. So hopefully that's been useful for you. Hopefully you have a touch of Byron mania as well now, and we'll be exploring some more of his poems soon, so you can watch those too if you do. So thank you for listening, and I'm sure I'll see you guys soon.